What's going on, everybody? Cleopas Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So to start off, my first pro for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the camera. Now with this phone, up front, we're getting a 13 megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we get a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So despite being one of Samsung's lowest end phones, when it comes to features, the camera setup on this phone is actually pretty impressive. In fact, compared to the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, the 5G version doesn't have an ultra wide camera, whereas again, the A14 4G does. So in general, if you do want a decent amount of features and you're maybe using your camera a bit more often, I do think for what it is, this phone will be a pretty good choice. And in addition to having some decent features, the photo quality here is pretty good too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the Samsung Galaxy A14, and in general, while of course not being the most amazing camera ever, for what it is, I do think the photo quality we're getting here is pretty decent. So if you're maybe not using your camera a ton, but you do want to get the occasional nice photo every now and then, I do think the A14 4G is a pretty decent choice. My second pro for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the storage. Now with this phone, we're getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely a lot of storage here. Now, I do want to point out that with this phone in my hand, it is the global version and it is factory unlocked, and while as of me recording this video, this phone hasn't quite made it to US carriers, I'm pretty sure at some point in the future it eventually will. So keep in mind, if you do end up getting this phone from a US carrier, the storage is probably going to be different considering the A14 5G has 64GB. I doubt they're going to give the 4G version more than the 5G, so chances are with this phone, the US version will end up having only 64, but even then, considering again this is really a lower end device, and a lot of phones in this general price range have even as low as 32. Even at 64, for the average user, that's going to be plenty of storage. And at 128, for a phone you can get under $200, it is definitely impressive. So either way, with the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G, for most people, storage is not going to be an issue here. My third pro for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the software. Now with this phone, we are getting Android 13, and in addition to this, keep in mind, Samsung does have really good software support, so with this phone, you can expect to get several other major updates in the future. I believe it will be getting Android 14, 15, 16, and 17, so in general, for a phone like this, that is impressive. I mean, aside from a Samsung, there are really not very many phones in this price range, if any for that matter, that are gonna get this many updates. So if you do like to get one phone and keep it for a longer time, and I mean like multiple years, but you still want to have the newest version of Android the whole time, then in that case, the A14 4G will be a great choice. Now my fourth pro for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the display. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch PLS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 400, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So in pretty much every way, we are getting a really good display here. Now don't get me wrong, it's not like a super fancy AMOLED or anything, but considering the price range of this phone, I want to say most non-Samsung phones around this general price are not going to have a 1080p resolution. Even at this point in 2023, we are seeing phones like the Motorola Moto G Stylus 4G, for example. That phone only has a 720p display, and even the Moto G 5G, which is actually supposed to be a bit higher end than this, that phone again still only has 720p, and same goes for like the OnePlus Nord N300 5G. Point is, there are phones that are higher end than this that have significantly worse displays. So overall, if you don't necessarily need a super high performance processor, 5G connectivity, and a bunch of fancy features, but you do want something that's really nice for consuming content like watching videos, for example, in that case, the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G will be a great choice. And then finally, my fifth pro for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is that it has a headphone jack. Now this might sound a little weird because you might be thinking every phone has a headphone jack, and for the most part, you would be right, but keep in mind, lots of manufacturers, specifically Samsung for that matter, have been doing away with headphone jacks. If you look at phones like the Samsung Galaxy A34 and A54 5G, which granted are a bit higher end than this, but still are technically budget phones, you will notice the headphone jacks are slowly disappearing, whereas luckily this phone still does have one. And while again, at this point in 2023, I want to say most budget phones still do have headphone jacks, I feel like it's definitely a feature we're going to have to enjoy while we still can, because in a few years, I wouldn't be surprised surprised if no phone had them anymore. But now that we've gone over some good things about this phone, let's go over some potential drawbacks. So my first con for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the overall design. Now at first glance it's really not bad when it comes to stuff like the front panel. We got slightly thicker bezels all the way around and a kind of less good looking water drop notch for the selfie camera. A water drop notch selfie camera is not going to look nearly as good as like a hole punch, but at the same time the front panel is still decent. I mean, it looks like a generic entry-level Android phone and in general definitely not really that bad. But when it comes to the sides and back, I feel like this phone has an unnecessarily bulky design. And on one hand, it's not really terrible. I mean, I have seen quite a bit worse with this phone, especially if you put it in a case. That's really just going to make it even more bulky, and for some people it might be uncomfortable to put in your pocket and sort of inconvenient to hold too. So in general, while it's not the worst I've seen, I feel like with this phone the design could be better. My second con for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the processor. Now with this phone, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G80 processor. And on one hand, the performance isn't really terribly slow, especially compared to other phones like it. So to be fair, it's definitely not the worst. But if you're planning on being on your phone a bit more, maybe you're someone who's always on social media, or maybe you're watching lots of videos, which granted it doesn't take an insanely powerful processor to watch a few YouTube videos, but still, if you really are looking for something that has an impressively fast processor, in general the Samsung Galaxy A14, despite the 5G version being actually really fast for what it is, the 4G version is not so much. So if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, doing more demanding activities, then overall I feel like you will be disappointed here. That being said though, to be fair, it's definitely not the worst. So if you're more of a light user and maybe you're using your phone for more basic activities anyway, then it should at least be okay. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance wise compared to your current device. Because of course, depending on what you're coming from, it may be a huge downgrade or it might be a bit of an upgrade. But overall, I feel like in general, this phone is really more meant for basic activities, so if you're doing anything beyond that, you are going to want to go with something faster, like for example, the A14 5G. Again, that phone is actually pretty fast for what it is, so if you do want something in that slightly higher performance mid-range, then I do recommend looking into that phone instead. My third con for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is the materials. So just like the design, I feel like when it comes to the materials on this phone, Samsung could have done a bit better. As you would probably expect, this phone is made entirely of plastic, except the display, but you know. And despite most phones like this, in fact, I want to say all of them for that matter, they're all made of pretty much the same kind of material. With the A14 4G, I feel like it just feels exceptionally flimsy. Now don't get me wrong, the build quality is at least decent, but at the same time, if you're looking for something a bit more durable, then you might be disappointed here. And honestly, compared to the A13 4G, I feel like the predecessor was actually better built than this. So if you do get this phone, sure, not everyone really cares about having more of a premium material. In fact, in this price range, probably very few people do. I do still recommend getting a case with this phone because if you drop it on a slightly harder surface, I feel like it's going to do quite a bit more damage than, say, a higher end device that has glass and metal instead. My fourth con for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is that it doesn't have NFC. Now, take this with a grain of salt, because if this phone is anything like last year's Samsung Galaxy A13 4G, we may see several different variants of it, and one of them might actually have NFC. I don't know why they do it like this, but they do, so just be aware. If when this phone makes it to the US, you get it from like Metro, for example, their version might somehow have NFC. But for the purpose of this video, this phone in my hand does not have NFC. So if you get it and want to use tap and pay, you will be disappointed. And at this point in 2023, with tap and pay becoming so common and widely used, I mean, at least in the US, if you go into any store, pretty much all of them have some sort of tap and pay. So I feel like it's a feature that even lower end phones like this really should have. But luckily, if you do really want a phone like this and you want to use tap and pay, keep in mind, as far as I know, every version of the A14 5G actually does have NFC, and the price difference between the unlocked A14 4G and the A14 5G at full price is really not that much. So if you really do want NFC, if that's a feature that matters a lot to you, definitely keep this in mind. And then finally, my fifth con for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G is that it doesn't have stereo audio. Now, in case you don't know what this means, when a phone has stereo audio, if you're doing something like watching a video, for example, you're gonna get sound from both the main speaker and the earpiece, giving you a much more immersive experience. Now, I will say, depending on how you're actually using your phone, this may or may not actually matter. In fact, if you maybe don't consume a lot of content, or you're always using headphones, you might not even notice. So if that's you, then you can pretty much disregard this. But at the same time, I feel like having stereo audio audio or at least a decent quality phone speaker in general is going to give you a bit more flexibility, so seeing that this phone doesn't have stereo audio was a little disappointing. But those were my pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A14 4G. In general, despite a few drawbacks, I do think for what it is, this is actually a pretty good phone, and once it makes it to the US and we start to see some nice carrier deals, for those of you looking for a more basic entry-level phone, I do think it will be a great option to consider. Now once again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely take a look at the description where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.